This has been an excuse to push cultural norms, the good, the bad, the ugly. And some of them I agree with. Some of the things that Elder Packer says in here is like, yeah, I can get behind that. I think we should do that. However, doesn't necessarily mean it's in the handbook. Doesn't necessarily mean everybody should do it, right? And sometimes there's this feeling of like the secret leadership club, right? Like, oh yeah, you're a leader, but I know how to really be a leader. Like, I know the right and wrong things to do, the unwritten order of things. I have a good friend who served a mission who his mission president would spend time in his own conference teaching the unwritten order of things. And he once went through the list of these things with me as far as everything from how to give a blessing to how to run a meeting and just inserting all these rules that again aren't written anywhere, but it was sort of this feeling of like, okay, I'm an accomplished mission president, so I'm going to teach you the unwritten order of things. And I guess my hope is that we maybe just pause and consider why we do things, where the things come from, and reassess, because like I said, these things can push cultural norms, a lot of good cultural norms, but also some that aren't so good or outdated that aren't helping us. Hey everyone, welcome back to Leading Saints Podcast. Today it's a monologue episode where I'm going to jump on here, and we actually recorded this in the Leading Saints community, which if you're not a part of, we're going to do more and more things like this where you can actually participate in some of the recordings of the Leading Saints podcast, ask questions and contribute thoughts and disagree with me or disagree with the guests or whatever, and just continue to foster some really interesting discussion around leadership. Now, the topic today is the unwritten order of things. And sometimes this phrase, I don't know if you've heard it before. Maybe you've just heard it in the context of a meeting and just thought it was a cute phrase that Latter-day Saints use. And from time to time, it gets referenced here on Leading Saints. And sometimes I'll even get an email and say, hey, Kurt, I don't know if you know this, but the unwritten order of things actually comes from a talk by Elder Packer that he gave at BYU. And I'm like, oh, believe me, I'm well aware of this talk. I find this talk really interesting because it has had such a unique impact on the leadership culture of the church. Because from time to time, as I've gone through various assignments and even growing up in my home and learning about leadership from my father and who served in various leadership roles, this phrase would often come up, the unwritten order of things. And basically it kind of gets framed as in, those are the things that maybe obviously aren't written down, but that we should definitely do. And this is interesting because as we throw this phrase around, I often think, well, have people even like listened to this talk, right? Now, I'm going to give you an opportunity at the end of this episode. I'm going to read through the talk. If you want to listen, if you want to hear the full talk, very interesting talk, very interesting tone, as Elder Packer always had. Now, before we get into this, I do want to give a shout out to Dave Lefevre, Sean Lesko, and Jared Goudat, who kind of helped me process this talk. And we all read it. We came together. We highlighted different things, pointed out different dynamics. And so shout out to them for helping me put my thoughts together and see what we learn here. So what is the unwritten order of things? There's actually a BYU devotional, as I said, a BYU devotional given by Elder Packer in October of 1996. Okay, so in my mind, I mean, that's not too long ago. I was 14. So, I mean, I wasn't aware of this until many years later. But as a leader's understanding, there's a consistent reference to this talk. And often it's in the context of like, oh, that's just the way we do these things, right? That's just the way it's done. That's the unwritten order of things. So it's almost like this trump card of like, oh, you can't disagree with us because that's part of the unwritten order of things, right? So there might be a setting, a council of some type, and maybe the leader says, oh, and be sure that when when the presiding authority speaks in a church meeting, that nobody speaks after that person. Somebody say, well, where's that written? Oh, no, that's part of the unwritten order of things, right? So unfortunately, this concept gets weaponized from time to time to push an agenda or an opinion that isn't in the handbook, that isn't written down anywhere, but for some reason we have this unwritten order of things. And sometimes I want to say, can someone just write down the unwritten order of things so that we know what there's not this secret game going on. And so this has been an excuse to push cultural norms, the good, the bad, the ugly. And some of them I agree with. Some of the things that Elder Packer says in here is like, yeah, I can get behind that. I think we should do that. However, Doesn't necessarily mean it's in the handbook. Doesn't necessarily mean everybody should do it, right? And sometimes there's this feeling of like the secret leadership club, right? Like, oh yeah, you're a leader, but I know how to really be a leader. Like, I know the right and wrong things to do, the unwritten order of things. I have a good friend who served a mission who his mission president would spend time in his own conference teaching the unwritten order of things. And he once went through the list of these things with me, as far as everything from how to give a blessing to how to run a meeting, and just inserting all these rules that again aren't written anywhere, but it was sort of this feeling of like, okay, I'm an accomplished mission president, so I'm going to teach you the unwritten order of things. And I guess my hope is that we maybe just pause and consider why we do things, where the things come from, and reassess, because like I said, these things can push cultural norms, a lot of good cultural norms, but also some that aren't so good or outdated that aren't helping us. So let's put it all into context. A few questions I'm going to explore here about this talk, the unwritten order of things, is what's the context? What does the talk even say? Is it binding, right? Was it in the handbook or the written order of things, right? That would be the handbook, the written order of things. So Elder Packer mentions a whole lot of different things, and doesn't necessarily mean it's in the handbook, right? So what's the context? 1996, in the church. Those of you that remember that time, if you were in a bishop in the 90s, this was even in my time when I first started in a bishopric, where handbooks weren't publicly available. Now they're so easy. Like literally every member of the church who's downloaded the Gospel Library app can open up the handbook, the general handbook, and read from it, right? Now, there were 2 handbooks, at least in my time. I'm sure going back even further, there are several more handbooks. But during my time, the first part of my leadership time, there were two different handbooks, right? There are 2 different colors. One was a general handbook. I think, I'm trying to think, it was book 2 that you could distribute widely, and book 1 had to be under lock and key in the filing cabinet in the bishop or the clerk's office, right? Or the bishop's office. And so book 2, you could you call a Sunday school president, hey, here's the book 2. Why don't you, sometimes I would photocopy different pages of that, the Sunday school section, and give it to them. Hey, just so you know, this is, here's some guidance on your calling, right? As you start as a Sunday school president, or even, working with youth, or pretty much every calling had at least a paragraph in the handbook. Well, in 1996, it was even hard to get a hold of the handbook 2 to even know what your calling was about. And but book 1, if I'm remembering the numbers right, was under lock and key, like I said. So I remember being called to a bishopric, and I finally got access. I could actually look in the handbook as long as I was reading it in the clerk's office or the bishop's office. I think, if I remember right, we all each got one. But I don't know if, again, it was maybe in the unwritten order of things that you had to keep them locked up in the filing cabinet at church rather than carry around. I remember many times these got leaked and put online, and the PR department would obviously have an issue with that, whatever. And now it's kind of just transferred just to just make it publicly available. So I think it's really understanding the context of this is that understanding leadership and the processes of the church, with handbooks not being available, this was sort of an anomaly. Like, it was sort of behind the scenes, behind the curtain, and people didn't really know how the administration of the church worked or why we do things. And so it was much easier back then to kind of see something the bishop does and think, oh, well, that's just how it's done. And he must have some guidance somewhere that tells him to do these things, right? So another thing considers, Elder Packer was a teacher. So naturally, he wanted to teach leadership. And this was a great forum to a bunch of BYU students, an upcoming, crop of future leaders, to begin to talk about leadership concepts to them. And so it makes sense that Elder Packer would take an opportunity to teach in a university, right, in this setting. And so I think it was a natural direction for him to go. He was also, as many of you know, very opinionated. There's some moments in this talk, as I read it, I'm sort of like, oof, like, sometimes using a lot of shame with leaders to teach them a lesson and those things, which I don't know if I would do that way, right? Another thing to consider, it was challenging to communicate leadership guidelines and update handbooks. And so, like today, they can make an update in the handbook, and it's just, as you sleep, it updates in the app. And you don't, sometimes as a leader, I'm looking through the handbook on the app and I wonder, I know this was the case, a few years ago. I better check again to make sure it hasn't changed. Well, back then it was extremely rare to get a new crop of handbooks, get a new edition of the handbooks. And so this evolving leadership guidance just wasn't there. So maybe a BYU devotional was a great venue to talk about leadership and make some tweaks to it, right? Another thing is during this time of the church, there was tremendous growth that was happening. And how do you stay on top of developing all these leaders around the world? And so I think this was just another way that, not that maybe the Quorum of the 12 came together and said, Elder Packer, go to BYU and teach them about leadership. But I think every general authority or apostle or member of the First Presidency was looking for opportunities to teach these concepts, because it was very difficult to quickly update the handbook, and the church was growing so fast, right? President Hinckley, another kind of, you get this vibe from President Hinckley this was just 1 year later, President Hinckley gave his talk where he talked about every member needs a friend, a responsibility, and the nourishment of the good word of God, right? So there's these little nuance, like the guidance, pieces of guidance that various general authorities were inserting into their talks to say, hey, this is maybe a way of leadership to consider, right? Another thing that happened, this a few years before this, but Elder Ballard's Counsel with Our Councils came a few years earlier in October of 93 and April of 1994. And then later, I think in 97 is when it actually got published as a book. So many of you might be familiar with the Counsel with Our Councils book, but you should know that actually started as a series of general conference talks that he then turned into a book, right? Another thing to consider for context, this is not published online by BYU Talks. I don't know if it was back then, if the internet was pretty young, so I'd be surprised if they were publishing it at that time. But you can't go onto BYU Talks and find this talk. So I don't know what that means or why, but it's something to consider, right? That maybe the church isn't perpetuating this talk, even though that's why I'm addressing it sort of in Leading Saints. It gets perpetuated a lot in leadership circles. Next is, what does the talk even say? Because oftentimes this is like an umbrella term that gets people insert their own unwritten order of things and kind of blame it on Elder Packer, right? Or blame it on this talk of the unwritten order of things. Or something I'm trying to think of an example, but well, I guess one example that comes to mind to talk about is when the presiding authority speaks in sacrament meeting, the unwritten order of things, you might hear it said like this, gives us a direction that that nobody should speak after them. You see this in general conference. So let's say President Eyring is conducting the meeting. President Nelson's going to speak. President Eyring will get up before President Nelson's talk, and he'll say all the closing things, right? Well, now we're going to hear from our beloved prophet. The choir will then sing this. This will conclude this session or this general conference or whatever. Like, he never gets up after President Nelson, right? Now, that's a good model. However, does that mean we have to do it in sacrament meeting, right? Well, it's not in the handbook that way, right? There's some guidance on what presiding authorities do, but it never says that nobody can speak after a presiding authority. And this actually came up when I was serving in the stake presidency. We had a visiting 70. It was an area 70 that came to town. He visited a ward, and this young bishopric, I mean, nobody taught them the unwritten order of things, and he stood up. The presiding authority gave some closing remarks, and then this bishopric second counselor or whatever stood up and announced the closing prayer, right? Well, that visiting area 70 sent us an email kind of in a negative fashion to correct this bishopric member. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, like, are we supposed to teach him these arbitrary rules and unwritten order of things when they're not written down anywhere? Like, how are we supposed to know what unwritten things to write down? Well, Elder Packer never talks about that in this talk, but sometimes it gets kind of just thrown in with, oh, that's part of the unwritten order of things. Like, well, who determines what's in the unwritten order of things, right? So let me just go over real quick. What are the 10 unwritten order of things that Elder Packer states? Now, there's a few nuanced ones that he inserts in there, but I went through the talk, and here are the 10 things that Elder Packer mentions as the unwritten order of things, and then we're going to determine if they're in the handbook or not. Okay? The first one, the person presiding at a meeting should sit on the stand or at the front near the person conducting. Is it in the handbook? No, it's not in the handbook. Okay. Now, to me, this is really good practice, because if someone's presiding in a meeting, Like, it'd be good to sit next to them if you're conducting the meeting, because then they can direct you on how this meeting is going to go, right? So if we're only singing one verse of the closing hymn, this I did as a bishop, and the stake presidency member was there, I'd turn to them and say, hey, we're over time. Do you want to just sing the first verse only in the hymn, right? And then I would stand up and announce that if that's the direction they would go. So again, good practice. I would probably recommend it, but I would never create the perception that this is in the handbook, because it's not in the handbook, right? All right, next one. The first counselor in a presidency sits on the right of the presiding officer. I think this is part a tradition that continues today, right? Is it in the handbook? No, it's not in the handbook. Again, I guess you could do that. I don't think it's hurting anything, but I also don't think it hurts anything if, maybe the second counsel likes to run the lectern, controls or whatever, or the microphone controls, right? But again, this is one of those things that's out there, that the unwritten order things, but it's not in the handbook. Members should not write to general authorities for personal counsel. Instead, seek counsel from your bishop, who may refer you to the stake president if needed. All right, is it in the handbook? Yeah, I think so. It's in handbook 31.2.1.2 instructs members to seek guidance from local leaders, bishops or stake presidents, aligning with this principle. So yeah, ideally don't write general authorities. And even though they talk about it in general conference talks of members writing them, seeking guidance all the time, which is kind of ironic. But and I think it's good for people to know that when you write a general authority, an apostle or somebody, it often, if not always, gets forwarded to your stake president or to your bishop. So if you're writing them and you think your bishop won't read it, you're probably wrong. All right, next one is, for blessings, go to your parents. If unavailable, then to your home teacher, obviously your ministering brother. Is it a handbook? No, it's not in the handbook. It's definitely kind to maybe not overload the bishop with requests for blessings or your leaders like that. And hopefully you've built friendships that you can turn to individuals, and it's not like you get more power from a blessing because somebody is more experienced or more articulate for those things. So, all right, this next principle that Elder Packer talks about is, the line of authority for revelation and counsel is vertical and should be respected. Leaders receive revelation in their own stewardships. So this is in part of saying that, if Elder Quorum president has a question, he should go to his bishop or stake president. If a bishop has a question, he should go, or needs advice, he should go to his stake president. Is this in the handbook? I would say no. You're encouraged to receive revelation and go that direction, but it doesn't necessarily prohibit anybody you can talk to. So Elder Packer kind of put it in this, that if you are a bishop and another family member is a bishop, or a coworker is also a bishop, you shouldn't go to them for counsel. However, I just feel that that's limiting, right? Especially the guy who produces Leading Saints, where we gather a community online where we discuss different leadership points. I don't think there's anything wrong with going online, reading something, being inspired, and trying something different, right? Or hearing how another guy in a different country or in a different state approaches his calling, and you do something different. I think that's what Zion looks like, right? And using modern day technology to share those ideas is a good thing, right? And I just think of how many bishops or stake presidents or relief society presidents out there have a degree in organizational behavior, but never draw upon what they learned in that degree. So again, this is another one that's kind of, I don't know if it really has any feet to stand on in 2025. All right, next principle is, never reject a calling, accept assignments given through proper priesthood channels. Is it in the handbook to never reject or a calling? No, it is not in the handbook. He also talks about not aspiring. I did a great episode on that, if I do say so myself. It's called Is Aspiring Wrong? So we'll link to that, and you can listen to that. So yeah, I think a lot of the church, a lot of the culture has shifted on this as far as never reject a calling or accept assignments given through proper priesthood channels. I think we just live in a different time with the dynamics of callings and the responsibility of modern day life and children and the obstacles they face in modern society and the time at home and family. Like, I think people are rejecting callings a lot. Now, not to say that they're all justified in rejecting that. I remember being in a bishopric and feeling like, I can't get anybody help out here. Like, Nobody's accepting callings, right? So no, that is not in the handbook. Next one. At funerals, the focus should be on preaching the gospel rather than talking extensively about the deceased. Is that in the handbook? Yeah, it is. Encourage simple spiritual. This is in handbook 20, chapter 29.5.4. Encourages simple spiritual services, but doesn't prohibit eulogies. So there's a partial alignment here. I think you're reading in the talk. Elder Packer's pretty strong on this one, as far as telling funny anecdotes or stories. But I don't know. I think we do a pretty good job there, and I think the family deserves a little bit of autonomy there with how the funeral is conducted, to not only preach the gospel, but also honor and value the person who is deceased. All right, the next one. I think this is 7 of 10, 8 of 10. There is value in learning church customs and traditions through observation and experience, as these are not always written in handbooks or taught in classes. No, it's not in the handbook. To me, this is kind of a dangerous one. I mean, that's maybe strong language, but I mean, yeah, great ideas can be perpetuated, as we know, by observing another person doing it. But terrible ideas can also be perpetuated by observing someone doing it, right? Even a leader. So I think we might be wise stewards, right? By observing what leaders are doing, but also not just assuming that everything that leader's doing has to be done that way, right? So many traditions are being done in the church where if you ask the leader, why do you do that? I don't know. It's just the way it's always been done, right? All right. The next one. The unwritten order sets a tone of dignity and order in meetings and activities, though it is not so rigid that the church will fall apart if not always strictly observed. So this is kind of a vague one. The unwritten order sets a tone of dignity and order. So basically saying that leadership should be done with dignity and order, right? Meetings should be conducted with dignity and order. Yeah. Is that in the handbook? No, I mean, not specifically. I think generally there's a guidance in the handbook to, be respectful and reverent and honor God and be appropriate, right? But so it's not necessarily in the handbook, but it's still great advice, right? So that's maybe a question for a ward council to wrestle with, is how do you maintain dignity? How do you do that, right? Are we doing it? Are we getting too relaxed in some areas? How can we make sure the dignity is consistent? All right, next one. A good leader is also a good follower, respecting the established order and authority. Is it required a good leader should be a good follower? Is that in the handbook? No, but again, good advice, right? There were a few others in here in the talk that it almost seemed like soapbox moments that Elder Packer was taking, which, believe me, I love a good soapbox moment, as essentially my weekly newsletter that I put out. Like he mentions that in the talk, that when you're sustaining someone to a calling, that you should use their full name, right? Maybe not their middle name or the middle initial, but if they're Chuck, they should be called Charles, right? Or if it's Sal, her full name's Sally or whatever it is. So again, is that in the handbook? I mean, no, but throughout the talk, there's just these soapbox moments, and that's the tough thing about the unwritten order things. I don't know when Elder Packer's like soapboxing or when he's like giving clear direction and about leadership principles, right? So the third thing, I've kind of gone through giving you a summary of those 10 things that are in the unwritten, like what are the actual unwritten order things. So if somebody says, well, yeah, Elder Packer talked about this in the unwritten order thing, you say, no, he didn't. That's not in there. So does that mean it's in the unwritten order things, right? So is this binding? Like, do these unwritten order things suddenly become written order things because they're written down, right? Or maybe President Packard, Elder Packard told BYU, like, hey, don't publish this talk because I want it to remain unwritten, right? It can be spoken, but not written. So is it binding? Well, one thing to consider is BYU didn't publish it, right? Which shows a lack of endorsement by an institutional body of the church. And there is a lot of history about an apostle publicly speaking about things that aren't necessarily accurate. I mean, Elder McConkie, Elder Benson, right there, and there's several others where things are said, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's now like law or it's binding or leaders have to do these things. The other thing that, again, I don't think Elder Packer was meaning for this to happen, but this can be very manipulative, right? By using this arbitrary phrase or pointing toward this talk about some arbitrary like things that are done in the church, and then making someone feel like they have to do it a certain way because it's in the unwritten order of things. So it often gets weaponized in these ways too, and it can be manipulative for a leader to get his way because he kind of just throws it in the unwritten order of things bucket. So is there a current unwritten order of things? I'd be interested for you to comment on this post in the Leading Saints community. And yeah, what are some current unwritten order things that aren't mentioned in Elder Packer's talk that still get perpetuated? I think, and hear me out here, like in this commentary here that I'm giving, I'm not saying like the unwritten order things are bad. Like many of these unwritten order things I agree with. To me, it could be framed as leadership best practices. And that's what we try and do at Leading Saints, right? That we're trying to broadcast and share as many leadership best practices as possible. Now, there's oftentimes when I sit down with somebody to interview them and we're going through the interview, in my brain, as they're talking about a certain concept, I'm thinking, I disagree with you on that. Now, sometimes I may bring it up or say, play the devil's advocate or whatever. But at the same time, I don't feel like I'm not going to pretend like I have it all figured out. And so maybe these principles that this other person's sharing, these are just best practices. The thing with best practices, they can be adjusted or shot down or disagreed with or depending on where you live, local adaptation should definitely play a role, right? And so there is this other part of it that I call it the tyranny of general authority, right? I mean, we love our general authorities. We have them visit our stake conferences. We listen to them in general conference. But it's so often a general authority can come to a stake or whatever and state something, and it comes with more weight, as it should, right? However, everybody in a stake presidency has experienced this, where visiting authorities come and sort of gone off about something about he's observing in the stake, but he's literally only been there a few hours. He doesn't have the breadth or the scope that the stake presidency has about the different problems in the ward or in the stake. And so it's completely appropriate for that stake president to say, I get that Elder so-and-so felt this way about this thing. However, using the keys and perspective we have now that general authority is left, we will take his counsel and discuss it and counsel over it. However, we have a lot more information than he does. And so we're going to continue on this path we're going or adjust it slightly different, keeping in mind the things that we were instructed, right? So that tyranny of the general authority, and this is, as I've had opportunity to meet with the priesthood and family department at the church, like I don't envy them because they're in such a tough spot where they're writing handbooks for an international church. And so they can't put this or that thing in there because that may mean something in the church in Africa as opposed to the church in Latin America as opposed to the United States church, right? And it hits differently. And so they have to be very intentional and be very broad or very careful with what they put in there, right? So when authority comes to town and makes an observation and makes a statement, sometimes we think, I think that's sort of scripture. We have to do that, right? And so with Elder Packer going to BYU and stating these things, it comes with that heaviness of there's this feeling of, this very meta moment here where, I think it's in the unwritten order of things that I have to do everything that a general authority says, right? When in reality, we have beautiful theology about priesthood keys and authority that a local church leaders can make those decisions and point in the right direction, right? So, yeah, there are unwritten order things, and that's what we talk about, but they're more, I like to frame them best as leadership best practices. And leadership through observation. This is really fascinating to me because, Elder Packer's sort of proponent of this, like some of the best training he's got was being the stake clerk and observing the stake president go about their business and things he learned when he was up in those positions, right? And I could go throughout my journey of leadership and state, leader after leader that I served with and state several things that I learned from each leader. But I could probably go through each leader and say, I observed some things that I'm definitely not going to do, that I definitely avoided, right? So it's sort of this double-edged sword here. And we do have a tradition of learning leadership through observation. And unfortunately, that's kind of led to this this hierarchy of like only bishopric members can become bishops, and only former bishops can become stake presidents, and only former stake presidents become mission presidents, and only former mission presidents become 70s, right? which I get and makes sense. However, there's a ton of priesthood that leaves out a ton of priesthood who never get an opportunity to serve in some of these incredible, involved, formal, intense roles because they don't have that experience, because just the math doesn't work out, right? 40 people in a ward can't be bishop at the same time. Only one can. And so that leaves out a lot of men to acquire that experience, where I feel like if someone's been a stake president, maybe people who haven't been stake president should be considered as mission president, right? Again, it's not my role, but I'm just thinking, like, sometimes we get in this mode of thinking, well, they definitely need that experience, that we can only call people who have observed that role. And unfortunately, it perpetuates bad traditions, bad leadership principles at the same time that it may perpetuate positive ones. I hope that makes sense. I'm kind of treading lightly because I know it's a sensitive matter. So that can be good or bad. And another thing to consider is, in leadership roles, like, let's make sure people are observing what's going on, right? That's sometimes easier said than done, but if you're a bishop, hopefully your counselors are having opportunity to observe a lot of things that you're doing, not just the things that involve them, right? And that way that'll prepare them more. And so the more observing we can give to people, the better. And the more people can get in the room for these meetings or whatever, I think is better. So maybe that's a principle, a best practice you can take away from this is, if you're in some of these more formal leadership roles, how can you get others involved to just even observe what you're doing and why you're making decisions, and maybe take an extra minute or two as you make decisions. Let me tell you why I made that decision, right? It's not always because the Spirit told me to. It's sometimes, I'm connecting some logic points here, and that's why I'm making the point there. All right. Principles versus prescriptions. He says in the Unwritten Order of Things, a principle is an enduring truth, a law, a rule you can adopt to help you make decisions. Generally, principles are not spelled out in detail. That leaves you free to adapt and to find your way with an enduring truth, a principle, as an anchor. The Unwritten Order of Things is like, he's presenting a principle that doesn't, there's ways to apply that principle differently. And I think sometimes maybe he's blending what a principle is and what is an application. He talks a lot about application in this talk, when I think he's trying to anchor it in a principle, but it's a little more complicated than that. So again, this commentary isn't necessarily to bash on the unwritten order of things or anybody's unwritten order of things. I think every leader should have an unwritten order of things, or in other words, every leader should have best practices, or every leader should feel it's in their right to establish some order of things. So, for example, you may have, I hear it all the time, a stake president calls a high counselor. Well, that high counselor has a beard. So that high counselor comes in, and depending on how bold he wants to be, he says, I don't want to shave my beard. And the stake president says, well, I think you should. And then the guy responds, well, it's not in the handbook, is it? No, it's not in the handbook, right? I still feel like the stake president has the right to ask, we're going to do things in a certain order here, right? I would like you to shave your beard. Now, obviously, they can discuss that. Maybe the stake president makes an exception. I remember as a young bishop, I felt it was important as a unified body of the bishopric that we all come to church in suits, or as we were out and about in our office or in our responsibility, that we are doing so in suits, right? Now, I think I'd be a little bit different today, as far as making weekly visits or whatever. But especially on Sunday when we're at church and doing the things, we need to be in a suit, right? And if there's other concerns there, that we can have that discussion. So I remember with one counselor, kind of saw he kind of show up in all sorts of different things, and I had a brief moment with him and said, "Hey, would you mind? I'd like to set a standard here that in our bishopric we wear suits when we, especially on Sunday," right? He agreed and wore a suit the entire time. Now, it's not in the handbook. However, as a key holder, as a person presiding, I had the right to establish an order of things, right? And so I would hope every leader feels a right and a direction to set an order of things how you see fit. However, don't blame it on the unwritten order of things. Elder Packer does it, right? That could be, sometimes leaders go there like, well, that's just how things are done, and you can't argue with me because it's in the unwritten order of things. Like, sure, you can have a discussion, and maybe that person isn't a good fit, or maybe you can find, common ground, or find a place to land where compromise that you can both live with, right? And I would just make sure these unwritten order things or these best practices aren't diminishing people, right? It's good to set an order of things and find your way to establish dignity, but hopefully it doesn't grind on people in a way like, I feel so restricted, or I can't be myself, or I've just always had a beard. I've had a beard for 40 years and now I'm in this random calling and the state president wants me to shave the beard. Hopefully it's not diminishing people, because then that's just not a good place to be. A good reference for this is I did an interview with Anthony Sweat. We talked about doctrinal models, and also Michael Goodman has one, I think it's on Why Religion, about doctrinal. No, I did it on Leading Saints. That's right. He did one on Why Religion well, but we can link to that. Also, we talked about this as far as what makes doctrine, right? So what turns the unwritten order of things into doctrine, or what turns something said in the handbook into doctrine? And so that might be a good path if you're kind of trying to figure this all out. All right, as we conclude, I just want to mention, every leader's got these unwritten order of things. They've got these best practices. A few that I've seen that aren't necessarily connected to a specific leader. Maybe if you do know who first started these, you can let me know. One is that the presiding authority speaks last. Nobody can stand up and talk after him. I think that's just been general tradition and general conference. It spilled over to the local church. In the past, men have prayed last. I think it's always been said that a priesthood holder has to close out a meeting, right? Or if a couple speaks, or a man always has to be the last speaker in sacrament. I think we're past that pretty well, but you see these crop up all the time, right? And sometimes it's good in the best practice kind of go against these for the sake of making sure they don't perpetuate when there's not a good reason, right? I think we always say, before you tear down a fence, figure out why it was put up. Well, if you can't figure out why the fence was put up, maybe you should consider taking it down, right? What about President Nelson? Does he have unwritten order of things? Well, yeah, he does. And they've actually been written down. For example, there wasn't an emphasis on taking the sacrament with your right hand in the handbook until President Nelson became the prophet. So that might be something that he feels strongly about, or his administration or whatever felt strongly about, to put it in the handbook. And it might go away maybe in another prophet or two, right? The use of the word Mormon, or the use of the full name of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? That was an unwritten order of things that President Nelson felt strongly about to put in the handbook. Now, I would be surprised if maybe future prophets kind of go more lax on that, right? Or they'll see another emphasis or another way to that. President Hinckley was more lax on that. He was intentional about being more lax on that. President Nelson's also talked about when you give a baby blessing to speak to, you're giving the blessing to the child, not praying to God, right? That wasn't in the handbook before. Now it is, right? So he's clarified some of these things, and that could change. I know President Hinckley, I think it was on my mission when he gave the talk about sort of doing away with mission farewells and homecomings. And that did, to some degree, end up it's kind of vague, but it is in the handbook now. All right. So the conclusion, what can we take away from this? I would just say the more autonomy a local leader has, the more effective the church is. And I think that's good advice. Obviously, I don't know how many general authorities listen to this, but something to consider for maybe stake leaders, right? The more restriction or the more unwritten order of things or best practices you kind of lay on the local leaders, it actually can make them feel more restrictive and diminish them as leaders. Give them autonomy. Obviously reference the handbook, but say, try some things out. What's your style of leadership, right? So the more autonomy local leaders have, the more effective the church is. And so communicate your unwritten order of things. Don't just make the assumption or think that people are going to just observe them and start doing them, right? If you feel strongly about how to order things in your jurisdiction, then articulate it, communicate it, right? It does set a tone for the culture. I love that the scripture in 1 Corinthians that let all things be done decently and in order. That's sound advice, right? But again, it's just about communicating these things. And I think if you do it in the spirit of, listen, I'm not trying to be like a tyrannical leader or tell you how to do your things, but I feel like this will bring strength to our culture. It'll establish a tone when we show up to church. It'll establish a tone when we come to meetings. It'll establish a tone in everything we do, which will then perpetuate more people coming to Jesus Christ, being drawn to us, right? Now, and hopefully as a leader, you can put some of these things up open for debate. Try and convince me that this is a bad way to do it. What problems do you see, right? And you may get to a point of saying, I see your point. However, this is just the way we're going to do it, right? And so that's the power of keys, but hopefully you're using them rather than just saying, well, it doesn't say in the handbook, and, or it's in the unwritten order of things, right? It's sort of it's vague, or you kind of feel like some leaders frame it as if they're a victim to the system, right? That, well, my hands are tied here because of the unwritten order of things. Like, what are you talking about? Right. Of course, some general guidance is needed, and that's why we have the handbooks. That's a big part of what we do at Leading Saints. We always encourage the handbook, that people should follow it and consider it. I talked about the visiting authority, the tyranny of general authority, that sometimes the general authority comes and it becomes like solidified in law because he said something. And these crop up in all levels of the church. I saw a clip online. I'm not going to share it because I don't want to promote the people that are putting it out there, but it was a clip where an apostle was in, it seemed like there was an interpreter so it was a non-English speaking country. And I guess it was maybe a humid climate, a hot climate. And this apostle takes off his jacket and he kind of says, it's kind of hot in here. I'm going to take off my jacket. And then the 70 that's in the room, it says into the mic, we always take our jackets off when the presiding authority does. Like, what? Right? I remember in the 80s, that was sort of a thing that you couldn't take your jacket off unless the presiding authority could. There's even a clip during, I think, priesthood meeting. President Benson is the president of the church, and it's hot in the tabernacle. And he takes off his jacket and invites everybody to take off their suit jacket as well. Can you not take off your jacket unless the presiding authority? Well, I'm probably going to take off my jacket if I'm hot, right? It's just these silly things. Like, why was that fence put up? What are we doing, right? And so it was worth considering. Again, these are all best practices. We encourage you to seek out best practices even through Leading Saints. Disagree with them, champion others that you like. Jump into the discussion. Tell us how you approach your leadership in order and so forth. But we'd love to hear that. Overall, join with me as I invite you. Let's be done with this term of the unwritten order of things. Try not to throw it around. Try not to use it. But to me, to say, these are some leadership best practices. This is what I believe. Maybe you disagree with these, but these are my leadership best practices. And so I invite you to do them. Or this is the way that we're going to order things in our stake or in our ward or in our relief society, whatever organization you preside over. So let's be done with the unwritten order of things and just talk about leadership best practices, things in the handbook, right? All right, that includes this commentary on the unwritten order of things. Now we have this link that you can send to people. If you ever hear this term, unwritten order of things, you can say, hey, wait a minute. I have a podcast episode that you need to listen to because that term is, what's this Kurt guy talking about? I need to go listen to this talk. Well, like I said, it's not on the BYU website. However, I did read the talk and record it. And so we're going to put that probably in another episode that will come out right after this. So you can listen to that if you want to listen to me reading the full transcript of the talk, and that will give you more perspective to share. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we need to champion this term of unwritten order things and get it out there. But let me know. Go listen to it and check it out. But hopefully I wish you the best in leadership, that you can create order, create dignity and respect in this beautiful restored church that we function in. Just don't use it as manipulation or to get your way, to blame it on the unwritten order of things. Let's set a new standard, new best practices, and bring people to Christ in the church through our leadership and the culture that we develop.